So hello again. My name is Michael David Jackson, Dr. Jackson, and it's my pleasure today to introduce, excuse me, Ananish Chaudhuri. Ananish is Professor of Experimental Economics at the University of Auckland and Visiting Professor of Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. So good afternoon, Professor.
Hi, Michael. Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you with me, Ananish. Ananish, I wanted to talk about your article. You published an article, you wrote an article last week in Newsroom entitled Offering a Different Perspective on COVID-19. And one of the really interesting aspects that you discuss in there, and one that you feel isn't necessarily discussed surrounding COVID and our lockdown, the range of unintended consequences, and particularly you talk, which I found quite fascinating, this concept of identified lives versus statistical lives. And I really wanted you to just expand on that for me, so I get an understanding of what that is and what are some of the untold consequences coming out the back of this type of lockdown.
Right. So just to set the scene a little bit, in my article I talk about this book by Gerd Gigerenzer. Gerd Gigerenzer is a behavioral economist at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, and he has this new book called Risk Savvy, where he says that in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, a lot of Americans decided that flying was too risky, so they all started driving. And it is estimated that there were more than 1,500 additional deaths on American roads because people were driving so much. So 1,500 is more than the people who died in the planes that crashed, excluding the people in the World Trade Center, etc. So that leads to this question that we often are very afraid of a lot of loss in lives in a very quick period of time, right? So this goes by the name of dread risk, things like that, right? And the idea is that we pay a lot of attention to something that's happening right in front of us, while not paying attention to things that are happening kind of in a more diffuse manner. So for instance, it's common that when people are asked kind of what are the leading causes of death in the world, a very common response is terrorism. But that's completely incorrect, right? The leading causes of death are things like respiratory illness, heart attacks, even drunk driving kills more people than terrorism does, right? But why does this not reflect on our collective psyche? And the reason is that the terrorism deaths are kind of right in front of our minds. It's on the pages of the newspapers, right? Whereas these other deaths, they kind of happen all over the place. They're more diffuse. They're not reported in an equally breathless manner, etc., right? So all I was trying to say is that, look, we are talking about whatever, eradication, suppression, mitigation. So one of the early influential papers was by this person, Neil Ferguson, and his colleagues from Imperial College, right? And they essentially said that in order to eradicate, we need to shut things down for 18 months, right? But that seems unusual, right? And the important thing to understand is that we are not talking about binary options here. So it's not suppression versus eradication or eradication versus mitigation. These are a continuum, right? At one end, you don't do anything at all. Then you could say, wear masks and gloves, no large gatherings, self-isolation, and then you make it more and more and more strict, right? So the social distancing is a continuum, how far you want to go along the continuum. And those choices come with other spillover effects, right? For instance, today we are talking about New Zealand's unemployment rate going up to 13.5%. In the United States, just because we get so much news from the United States, nearly 15 million people have filed for unemployment. this is far more than the numbers we saw during the global financial crisis, right? And this has consequences. So we are not talking about dollars and lives here, lives versus dollars. We're talking lives versus lives. We know that when unemployment goes up, the life expectancy of those people go down. Furthermore, there are consequences for communities. If you have this high level of unemployment, then communities get devastated. You have increase in depression, increase in poverty, increasing hunger. Now, not all of those things apply equally to all countries, right? New Zealand, we might be able to survive better, except we rely very heavily on trade. So it's not clear what the outcomes would be, right? But in terms of suggesting palliatives, suggesting alternatives, when the epidemiologists say we need to take measures that kind of minimize deaths, the point to understand is it's not really minimizing deaths. If you minimize deaths from COVID, you are going to get increase in deaths elsewhere. In some third world countries, for instance, this is literally death from hunger and poverty if you shut down all activity, right? Because these are people who literally live hand to mouth. So I don't know, if you are, a Uber driver and things like that, I would be worried. And we are just going to, I told you we're on this thing, we're going to ask people these questions that people are now, in many cases, worried about paying their mortgage, they're worried about paying rent, and things along those lines. So those things have costs, and those costs are also affecting people's lives and loss in lives as well. So all I'm saying is that the epidemiology view, my wife is an infectious disease specialist at the University of Auckland Hospital. So she doesn't necessarily agree with me. But all I'm saying is that when you say that we are going to minimize deaths, that's not necessarily correct, because there are unforeseen consequences of doing that. Okay, I'm going to stop here.
I think we'll stop the interview there. Professor Ananish Chaudhuri, thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks, Michael.